you just became one sort of serendipitously, right? You didn't go to the FBI and said, hey, I want to go in there and get some info for you. They just happened to see you. Why didn't they think you were just a normal worshiper?
A couple of conversations, I don't know. I guess they thought I was quick-witted and I spoke really good English, and I was obviously, I don't know, I guess they just vetted me over a couple of interactions. I mean, I stayed friends with those guys for 20 plus years, so they trusted me, and we just went from there. I guess I was trustworthy until I wasn't, and basically they didn't find any reason not to trust me.
All right, so this is long before 9/11.
Yes.
You're being paid as an informant. You keep just going to these mosques. You're feeding the FBI information. It's not a high priority item, but they are paying you to do this. What happened when 9/11 hit?
Well, before 9/11, I become so entranced by this, and the community I'm a part of is so interested in what I'm doing and basically distinguishing between mainstream and radical Islam. I moved to DC to basically be more involved in representing the community. And this is 1990, I moved in about 96, 95, 96. The Tanzania, Kenya bombings come out in 1998. And we happen to be hosting a conference talking about extremism. So from there, CNN broadcasted from our conference. And the State Department found out about what we were doing based on the CNN broadcast. We were invited to do an open forum, and that's where the relationship with the State Department starts.
So you're a 1099 to the FBI. Now suddenly you're about to be employed by the State Department.
Yes, and the informants are not 1099.
Okay. Well, that's just kind of business ease we use here. You're either an employee or you're not.
Bags of money that are past hands.
Okay, I get it. IRS, don't listen to this.
Yeah.
Okay.
The FBI contractor part comes when you actually, I became a Beltway bandit. So you basically end up getting paid by NGOs that are paying you from U.S. government money to perform a function.
Okay.
So we're basically the people on the periphery. So whenever you're not in government, when you're a federal contractor, you're basically getting money through a cutout.
All right.
To do things that the government doesn't necessarily want to do directly.
So they want to kind of wash their hands of it, pay a non-government organization to actually do what the government wants them to do. It's almost like, I hate to say it, money laundering. They don't want.
Well, you're not laundering. You're not giving it back to them. You're giving the product
true.
back. So you're not laundering it for them to basically use it later for diapers.
That's true. But they don't want to be connected to it. Okay. More. With Eddie and you're not going to want to miss our conversation. This is going to be very interesting. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, on the American Family Radio Network. Back in 2 minutes.
Every day, babies in their mothers' wombs are fighting for life, with abortion being the leading cause of death.
I already had my mind made up. I was like, I'm going to go through with it.
The Ministry of Preborn has pregnancy centers nationwide, standing by to help young moms in crisis choose life. Preborn is the largest provider of free ultrasounds in the country. By letting a mother see her baby in the womb and hear the heartbeat, she's 80% more likely to choose life for her baby.
I came seeking termination, but once I got here and I took an ultrasound, I was overjoyed when I found out that I was having 3 baby boys.
Preborn's mission is to help save babies' lives and souls. To find out more, go to preborn.com. That's preborn.com. Or dial pound 250 and say the keyword baby. That's pound 250 and say baby. Your love can save a life. As events unfold and new information is made.
よかった今日のメッセージは。新垣先生のよりも良かったかね。
それはもう全然違うよ。
ああ。
Missions updates.
More than 3 300,000 children have been forced from their homes in Haiti this year.
And the fight for life. Bates is challenging an Oregon Department of Human Services rule that excludes her from adopting any child because she would not violate her religious beliefs to promote Oregon's radical gender ideology. You can settle for what's called mainstream, or you can tap into the flow of news that matters most to you and your family. American Family News. Find us on the radio, online, or on our app. Get all the details at afn.net. afn.net.
If you're low on the FM dial looking for National Public Radio, go no further. We're actually going to tell you the truth here. You will never hear this on NPR. We're talking to Hedy Amiramati, and she, for about 20 years, worked in many capacities in counterterrorism, both inside and outside the United States government, served 5 presidents over 20 years at very high levels. She also has her law degree. She now heads a ministry called resurrectministry.com. Resurrectministry.com. All right, Hedy, let's pick it up right where we left off. So there are some jihadist attacks in 1998. President Clinton was president at that time. I think I remember him sending missiles somewhere as a result of that.
Yes.
And then what happened? Yeah, the State Department discovers what you're doing. What happens after that?
Yeah, so I basically do a number of speaking engagements for high-level national security advisors, other federal contractors that are off the grid, Congress, events for the State Department. There's an International Religious Freedom Roundtable, a whole variety of projects that are basically calling attention to extremism, but really it's still very low key. People don't want to, especially the Clintons, they didn't want to publicly talk about Islamic extremism. It was very uncomfortable. It was still an uncomfortable truth. You know, to this day, I think it's still an uncomfortable truth, but back then it was definitely something that was on the down low. Mm-hmm. But once 9/11 hit, it was, I was cool before it was cool. So it was catapulted my career. I ended up going to Afghanistan. I served as a political officer under Ambassador Khalilzad. And then when I came back, I went to a couple of think tanks. So in DC, before all this commotion and the acrimony between the Trump administration and the rest of the government, when the Republicans went out, you would go sit in a think tank, you would do some work, you would think big thoughts, and then when your administration came back, you'd come back, and then the Democrats would go into the think tanks. And so we did this over and over and over again based on whatever administration was in power. So we were still doing the work, it was just the capacity in which we did it. If that makes sense.
Now, coming up to 9/11, was there any sort of mild warning signs that a big attack was coming? Do you recall?
Oh, absolutely. I got myself involved in a very...
教会では喋った？誰かと今日は。教会では誰かと喋った？
挨拶したよ。
ああ。
It's kind of a little complicated, but the president of Chechnya, Moskov, had come to our conference, and he basically was trying to alert the U.S. government that bin Laden was planning an attack against the United States, that he was transporting suitcase nukes, that he was recruiting jihadists to basically launch this attack against the West. Well, we were accused, it was in national papers, international papers, that this is a Spectre bazaar, that we were claiming that bin Laden was doing this. And so it was extremely ill-received. I can't even tell you. Members of Congress thought we were crazy. It was a really difficult time until, of course, 9/11 hit, and people were like, "Oh, how did you know that?" So it was a precarious time.
Then in the period right after 9/11, what was your role, say, for the first 2 or 3 years after that?
So a lot of it was, so President Bush, I don't know how much people recall, but he had this whole thing about why do they hate us and promoting democracy, and if we promoted democracy in the Middle East, people would like us better. Right. So they sent a bunch of us out all over the world basically talking about being an American Muslim, how great it was, why do you hate us, let's talk about it. There were these trips of goodwill to other Muslim nations, and for the most part, they were a disaster. The other nations were extremely unfriendly. They said I was bolder than most because most people would just kind of cow to whatever pressure the locals were giving. I wouldn't. I refused to because I knew enough about Islamic extremism to hold my own in an argument. But it was a very long effort. And then I went to Afghanistan, and when I came back, we were gearing up for the war in Iraq.
Okay, so the idea that we're going to somehow bring democracy to Muslim nations that have been Muslim nations for, in some cases, centuries. Why is that a fool's errand?
To this day, I don't know if people were just stupid or it was intentional, because it really did lead to the entire unraveling of the Middle East. It led to all the mass migration we see now throughout Europe. I'm sure we'll get to that conversation. But at the time, it felt like the U.S. diplomatic corps was at its foundation atheists. So they couldn't understand the power of theology. They couldn't understand people that lived with an eternity in mind, because they weren't Christians, so they were secularists, they were atheists. So they didn't understand the power of theology to motivate people to do something for decades and centuries. So when those of us were trying to explain, listen, this doesn't work because they have a global expansionist faith that requires them to destroy you, ultimately. That sounded silly or stupid. And so they're like, you just don't understand the way the world works. We understand the way the world works. We give somebody some money, we give them a good life, we build wells, they'll like us. They'll end up just like us. You know, and none of the people that were there, because it was more than just me, tried to convince them that this doesn't work in the Middle East. Nobody accepted it. The powers that be did not.
Hedia, did any of them study the last 1,400 years of Islamic history?
Remember, at the time also, Bernard Lewis, who was a great, historian, was an advisor to many of these officials. But it still didn't sink in. So even though there were people like him who were very clear about the ideology, people that had the power to move this massive machinery that is the U.S. government didn't buy into it.
And do you think, let's fast forward,
Sure.
right now, the Biden administration, do they think the same way? We can democratize the Muslim world?
This seems much more insidious. This seems much more insidious to me because and maybe it's because I'm not sitting in on those conversations, because I know when I sat in on the conversations, I just felt that they were being stubborn and that they really passionately believed what they were doing. But now the way we're treating the borders and the way we're causing this mass migration into Western countries, it seems like the ultimate goal is not the result of not understanding the Middle East. It's a result of wanting this kind of Marxist globalist control because they need to undermine. So this is exactly what the jihadists do in Muslim countries. You have to deconstruct the cultural fabric of that country. So way before the jihadists came for the West, they were destroying Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. So those millions and millions of Muslims that had a normative practice of Islam, in order to remove that normative practice and supplant a jihadist ideology, you had to destroy the infrastructure. So you had to basically stop the tribal leaders, hang them from trees for 3 days till their corpses smelled, scare everybody out of their minds. You had to stop the civil society infrastructure that existed at the grassroots, whatever that may be, and replace it with people of your own persuasion. So that's what I see happening here too, is that we're basically trying to dilute. They use the term MAGA extremists, but if we could all put aside the incendiary nature of that term and just say American Christians, then you could better understand what they're doing. They're trying to demonize American Christians because they want to replace us with the globalist Marxist party and their people.
Yet, if I understand radical Islam to any degree, their just in bed with the Marxists until they can take over, and then they'll do away with the Marxists as well. Do you agree?
Absolutely. But they learned the organizational skills, the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood, learned from the Marxist movement in Egypt. So that alliance between the left and the Islamists has existed for decades. They learned how to organize. They learned how to gain control of a society. They learned influence operations. They learned terrorism tactics. All of that they learned from Marxist ideology.
But why would Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, okay, you know Kamala Harris leans Marxist, but Joe Biden, first of all, has kind of been all over the map, but if you were to look back on his career, say 20 years ago, he'd be considered kind of a middle-of-the-road leftist senator, but not a Marxist, not a way left guy. What happened? He's not calling the shots? Why is the border open?
I don't think he's calling the shots. Based on, I know a lot of people in this administration. I worked with them back in the Obama days. So, before Trump comes in, these are all the same players. Lisa Monaco, actually even Kirby. I worked with Kirby a lot in the Defense Department. So
John Kirby, wasn't he was he a naval officer, or he was a?
Yes.
Okay.
So he was an executive in the Department of Defense.
Right. Okay. So
yeah.
Is he a one world government guy, or are there these people? What are they? What are they doing?
I didn't think so. When I knew him, I tell my husband all the time when I look at the TV, I was like, I don't know what happened to him. He was normal 10 years ago. So a lot of these people, I don't understand what's happening, but I just think that the only thing I can explain it is that besides the demonic force, so we can't deny, we're Christians, we understand.
Sure.
There's a demonic force at play here, pushing people. And I think that's also, combine the demonic force with money. So there's a lot of money at stake in this apparatus. So the military-industrial complex, when we say that, when we say we're giving billions of dollars to Ukraine, we are not giving billions of dollars to Ukraine. We're giving billions of dollars to American contractors to play footsies in Ukraine. So they get a couple of guns that we make, they get a couple of planes and missiles and artillery that we make, and they get to play cops and robbers. But at the end of the day, that money is funneled back to our country. So they have all of these people with these special interests, whether it's money, ideology, or just plain hatred of anything that's backed by God. And they've all united forces. And it's this confluence of evil and negative forces that is driving this machinery. And so when people tell me, I'm sorry, but I get really frustrated when some politicians or commentators are like, well, Trump needs to go in and fire 75% of the government. First of all, they're under contracts. It's illegal to do that.
Well, we're going to see if anything can be done about the demise of the West right after the break with my guest, Hedia Miramati. As you can see, she's very knowledgeable. She's been on the inside on counterterrorism and geopolitical operations. So don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turk, back in 2 minutes.
Twice a year, American Family Radio opens the phone lines to ask for listener support in our effort to promote godly values. We call it Share-a-thon. And it's also your chance to tell us your AFR story.
I was headed to work one morning and just happened upon the radio station, and I honestly don't think that my station has changed since then.
If God has used AFR in your life, we'd love to hear you tell us about it.
I've been a big help in keeping my mind straight and walking with the Lord. Thank y'all very much.
Your story can be an encouragement to our radio staff and to other listeners as well.
AFR has helped me out a lot. It helps me to keep in touch with the Lord. It's a good reminder that God loves us.
Call us at 877-876-8893 and give us a 1-minute voicemail telling us your AFR story. That's 877-876-8893. And then listen for your voice during Share-a-thon, October 8th, 9th, and 10th on American Family Radio.
If you are 65 or older, you know this, inflation is hitting everyone hard right now, especially when it comes to healthcare. Over the last 10 years, healthcare costs have skyrocketed by, get this, 230%. If you have Medicare Parts A and B, you know there are still out-of-pocket expenses like deductibles and co-payments, and they really add up. But here's some good news.
教会で 何牧師の奥さんと喋ったの？黒人の牧師の奥さんと。
挨拶して。
ああ、向こうから来てきたの？
そう。
Retirees, people love it. Medishare 65 Plus just makes sense. To learn more, give them a call. They're great to talk to. They'll offer to pray with you each time you call too. Call now. 833-45-BIBLE. That's 833-45-BIBLE. 833-45-BIBLE.
Ladies and gentlemen, one of the biggest differences between Christianity and Islam is the resurrection of Jesus. Did it really happen? We've actually created a brand new course, myself and Dr. Michael Acona. It's going to start in October. It's called Did Jesus Rise from the Dead? Evidence and Objections for the Modern Mind. Go to crossexamine.org, click on online courses. You'll see it there. If you take the premium version, you'll be live with Mike and me on several occasions for Zoom Q&As. Also want to mention there's a lot of events coming up next week. On the 24th, September 24th, we'll be at McNeese State University. That's in Louisiana near Lake Charles. And it's open to anybody. We'll also live stream it. The next night we'll be at Little Cypress Mauriceville High School. That's in Texas, just over the line. We will have that live streamed. And the night after that, pray my voice holds out, Lamar University, Beaumont, Texas. That's the 26th of, September. The following week, I'll be at Rock Point Church the evening of October 1st. All of that will be live streamed. We'll also live stream the next new Bible study on the 30th of September. So check our calendar for more on that. And thanks for your support. To do these college and high school events, we don't charge students a dime. We raise money to do it. You make it happen. And then we live stream it to reach thousands of others. So thanks so much. We're talking to my guest today, Hedia, who has been inside the government and outside the government in counterterrorism roles over 20 years, serving 5 presidents. And Hedia, before the break, we were talking about Ukraine, and we were talking about money, that people want that war to go on so money can come back to us. Talk a little bit about disinformation, because a lot of governments practice disinformation. First of all, what is it, and what's your experience with it?
It is strange to watch the shift in our government. I think what is really important for your listeners to understand is there is no crime or law against lying. And that is a foundational principle of the marketplace of ideas. Our First Amendment freedoms are based on the idea that people can say dumb things, bad things, ugly things, and that we believe as a society we would choose the right things over the bad things or the wrong things. When people want to start criminalizing or legislating, or our government officials want to legislate against disinformation, what they're saying is, you American people are not smart enough to decide what's true and what's false, what's good and what's bad. Because disinformation is basically a projected falsehood from one person or two people, whatever's perspective. It's from a perspective. So they can basically say, Jesus rising from the dead is disinformation. That's their perspective. There's only 2 genders. That's disinformation. Anything can be disinformation from a certain perspective. That's why in this country we don't have laws against hate speech. We have laws against violence. So it's the Brandenburg test from the KKK back in the 70s, I believe, where if your speech is causing an imminent threat of harm, you cannot yell fire in a theater. But if barring that, an imminent threat of harm, you can lie and say ugly things all you want. And the fact that we're now saying that that is a threat to this democracy and to our society, Christians better be careful, because we're the first ones on the chopping block if that goes through. Because everything we say is unpalatable. It is foolishness to those who are perishing. And we really have to understand what's at stake.
You know what I think is disinformation that comes out of our government? And maybe you disagree with this, but that's okay. If you did, it would be disinformation, no, I think it's not just our government, but a lot of times it comes out of our government that we have to combat Islamophobia. Because I think Islamophobia is a bogus term. And the reason I say that is because Islam is not a race. Islam is an ideology. And there are people of all different, I know there's one race, the human race, but we'll use it in the way people normally use it. There are all different races of people who are Muslims. And nobody should oppose Islam because different races may be Muslims. But we might want to oppose Islam if they want to say bring Sharia law to the United States, or they want to bring jihad to the United States. I don't think that we ought to accept Sharia law. It's unconstitutional. Obviously, we don't want jihad here. Yet I think too many people try and smear opposition to Sharia law and jihad by calling it Islamophobia when it makes good sense to be against Sharia law and jihad. What are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. The extreme version of this. So first of all, we did a lot of work on Islamic terrorism, especially when ISIS was on the rise in 2015. And every step we took, we were accused by the Islamist organizations of being Islamophobic. You're Islamophobic. You're just trying to persecute Islam. It's basically a way of shutting up your opponents. So we're seeing it now in Europe. We're seeing it in the UK. They're basically putting people in prison for retweeting, for reposting social media posts about riots because they say it's Islamophobic, or it's causing racial tensions. Because when people want to speak out and tell the truth about something that's happening in their towns or their neighborhoods, if you slap a label of discrimination against it, then everybody becomes afraid of speaking out because they don't want to be labeled.
Can you help us understand what is going on with the riots in the UK? Because it seems like some people are upset that Islam and Sharia law is encroaching on them, taking their freedoms away from them. And then there are some people who are saying, well, we can't stand for this. We've got to fight against this. What's going on over there? Can you tell us?
Absolutely. So I spent a lot of time in the UK. I was actually funded by the UK government as well to build a moderate opposition to the Islamists. It was not successful, by the way. But what you're seeing now is the culmination of mass migration of populations of people from communities and countries that are antithetical to the West. In other words, they came after the color revolutions of Libya, all throughout Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, and so they've lost their home countries as a result of the wars, and now they're migrating to Europe. And they're hostile, they're angry, they didn't want to migrate. It's not like my parents who came in the 60s to live the American dream. It's not because they're trying to live a dream. They're there because their homelands were destroyed and because they think that they're going to have better opportunities in Europe. But at the back of their mind, when they're Muslims, they always have the idea that Islam will be victorious. It's a global expansionist ideology. Their goal is to overcome the Jews and the Christians and to dominate that society, even if it's not by violence. So that's ultimately the goal. Just as Rome fell, the West will fall. And so if you combine that into these small pockets, these countries with much smaller square footage than we have here in the United States, there's a culture war that's happening with the indigenous British population and these immigrants. And as a consequence, and not only that, but because of the speed at which they're migrating, they don't have jobs available for them. They don't learn the language, the native language. And so what do? They form gangs. So they're the child traffickers. They call them South Asian gangs because they don't want to call them Muslim gangs, but they're made up of Pakistanis. And they traffic in women, they traffic in drugs. So they're degrading the society with criminality in addition to destroying it culturally. And I'm sure your listeners have heard at this point of no-go zones. Some of those places in England, even as a Muslim, I would travel to, where they told me I needed a mahram, I needed a male escort to go to South Hall. because I would be harassed by the locals for being an unaccompanied female.
I'll tell you, the one time I was in Paris, we were driving around and we took a wrong turn, and Hedia, I thought I was in Saudi Arabia.
Right.
I mean, suddenly we're in this neighborhood, everybody's covered. It was a transformation just over a block or two.
Yes.
And it was like, how do we get out of this neighborhood? It's like we're sticking out here. We're not in Paris.
It's scary.
Yes.
And then can you imagine living in that? So what you see in these riots, I think, and it reminds me of the problem of J6, where there was people, thousands of people who went to protest what they thought was an unfair election. That's a democratic right. That's a right as Americans. But what happened? You had a bunch of agitators in there. You had people that were there to cause trouble. You had government provocateurs. And that's the same thing we're seeing in the Europe riots, where they're just angry British people that want to complain and protest what their government's doing, and yet there's all these agitators that are included in the mix, and then at the end of the day it ends up overblown and the government wants to clamp down and they go too far and it ends up creating an even bigger problem.
So when you say government provocateurs on January 6th, what do you mean by that?
I mean, I'm of the opinion there were people there that were provoking the crowd. So I've been on the other side of that and what it's like to be an informant. I mean, you're not on the books, so to speak. So there are plenty of people that they could have had in that audience, because it's just, I mean, if you've been to enough of these rallies, you know, for the most part, these people are not engaged in violence at all. They're actually quite friendly people. And so the commotion that we saw does not look indicative of the movement.
Well, it's certainly not an insurrection. It's the only insurrection in history without any weapons.
Without weapons.
Right.
Exactly.
And if you look at the video that the January 6th committee hid, because it was a political kangaroo court, hid from the American public, was the video of Capitol Police escorting Buffalo Man through the Capitol and escorting people as if they're on a tour. Now, obviously, there was some things they did they shouldn't have done. It was about 100 stupid people that went into the Capitol when they shouldn't have. But you're saying, in your opinion, there were some provocateurs there that instigated them on. And of course, couldn't overthrow the United States government with a Buffalo Man staff or whatever the guy had. I mean, it now has flipped. And what I want to ask you when we come back from the break, Hetty, is, because you pointed this out in your conversation with Jack Hibbs, there was a point where the focus of the United States government flipped from Islamic terrorism to domestic terrorism, and they define domestic terrorists now as moms going to a school board meeting or anybody who is conservative. What about that? What can we do about it? A lot more with Hedia Miramati, an attorney and also somebody who's worked in counterterrorism for 20 years. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist with me, Frank Turek, back in 2 minutes.
AFA Action takes attacks on the family seriously. The enemies of the family constantly employ new tactics to try to sneak past our radar. They know if we stand together, their evil plans will fail. Your gift to AFA Action allows us to stay vigilant against their onslaught. And if you give this month, you'll receive access to the Cultural Institute video When Your Faith is Illegal by Frank Harbor on AFA Stream as our thanks. You can make your gift today at afaaction.net.
If you say, I don't have any Christian friends, that's a shame. Because how are you ever going to win your friends if you don't even have any? We're to serve those in darkness, but not participate in their deeds.
Join Dr. David Jeremiah for his series in Ephesians, Belief That Behaves. Next time on Turning Point.
5:30 a.m. and 7 p.m. Central on American Family Radio.
The words you are about
about to hear are taken from letters sent in by members of the Trinity Debt Management Program.
Dear Trinity, today I'm making my final credit card payment.
Before I came to you, I was in a constant state of anxiety and panic, but now there is hope for my family's financial future.
Working with Trinity made me understand that I'm not alone.
You really do help people.
Your kindness will never be forgotten. Without Trinity's support, I would not have achieved my lifelong goal of becoming debt-free.
We saved a lot on interest and penalties, of course, but the reward was the gift of human kindness.
Trinity has carried me through a very difficult time in my life. You're amazing.
I used to feel so anxious and hopeless. Now I feel grace and peace.
God bless Trinity as you continue to help others become debt-free.
If credit card debt has you down, call Trinity at 1-800-788-1813. That's 1-800-788-1813.
When and why did the United States government flip their emphasis from looking out for Islamic terrorism to looking out for what they consider to be domestic terrorism, which unfortunately has turned out just to be conservatives? When did this happen? Why did this happen? I remember Hedia, and by the way, my guest, Hedia Miramati, go back to the beginning of the show for her bio, quite impressive. But Hedia, I remember back in the Obama administration, there was a lady by the name of Lois Lerner at the IRS who the Obama administration used to target conservatives.
Yes.
And it seemed to be like this is where it really began to be noticed. When did all this flip from Islamic terrorism to now we're going after conservatives? They're the bigger threat.
So by all indication, I was still at FBI headquarters in 2016. So by all indication, the entire law enforcement apparatus, DHS, DOJ, FBI, everything shifted once Trump was elected. I know because I was funded and we were building programs. I was building terrorism prevention programs across the United States with the FBI. So I know that's what our focus was up until Trump's elected. Once Trump's elected and in office, as an FBI, I was a personal services contractor, which is a quasi-employee sitting at headquarters. I was not allowed to go over to the White House. We were forbidden unless we had a special detail or permission from Andy McCabe or others to go over there. We weren't even allowed to go over there. So there was a complete shift to Russia. You know, we spent years in that investigation. And I think when you fast forward from that change all the way up now through Biden, the entire Islamic terrorism apparatus that I and several others, you know, dozens of contractors